This module is about the PLSS and Sanborn maps. This is the last discussion of maps that I'll have. And again, there are no readings that go with this here, so this is all based on the lecture, and you can look at the slides as well. So this is, to me, a very important topic, one that will be useful to you as a citizen. So it's interesting too, but this is the PLSS is just a shorthand for the Public Land Survey System, otherwise called the American Land Survey, or perhaps the Township and Range Survey System. It goes by different names. We'll call it the PLSS, or the U.S. Public Land Survey System. It has its origins with Thomas Jefferson. This was one of Thomas Jefferson's doings. And it was brought into existence with the Land Ordinance of 1785. Now, if you think back in American history, 1785 is after American independence and finalized in 1783, but it's before the Constitution of 1787 and the ratification of the Constitution in 1789. So the Public Land Survey System was created under the United States Articles of Confederation government. It was that Articles of Confederation government before we were a federal system, or at least before we have our present federal system. The idea of the Public Land Survey was, there are several reasons for it, but primarily it was created to dispose of the federal public domain to settlers. You can explain what we mean by those terms. To dispose, when you dispose of something, you throw it away, right? Well, that's not really what we mean. In the case of land disposal, that term refers to land that is being distributed, land that is being given away, and land that is being eliminated from the United States public domain. Now, public domain has a lot of meanings these days. You might think of public domain as something like public domain software or public domain illustrations on the internet. But the public domain originally meant in the United States, it referred to all of the lands that had been turned over from the states to the federal government. And so basically the public domain refers to all of the land that was owned by the United States federal government. Now, who is the United States federal government? Technically, it is Congress, and Congress are our elected representatives. So the idea is that the United States federal government is the people, okay? So the government is the public, and so the federal lands are public lands. They are owned by no one in particular and everybody in general, okay? And that's still the way it works. The public domain lands of the United States are mostly in the western states, the mountain western states. Nevada, for example, is about 80% public domain land still today. So the public domain, or the federal lands of the United States, existed. They were a very large part of the United States early on in its history. The very first public domain lands were the lands that the states had given over to the federal government after the Revolutionary War. They had a lot of conflicting claims, and eventually the states, with the ratification of the Constitution, the states all agreed to turn over or relinquish their western land claims that went all the way to the Mississippi River, relinquish those to a federal government, which would then forgive those states of their debts. And so the idea was that the states handed over land to the federal government would then hand it over to individual settlers from the states. So the public domain land was created and was intentionally going to be given out to American settlers over American history, over the coming decades. How would it do that? Well, it wouldn't actually give the lands away. The original idea, was that the federal government would actually sell lands to individual settlers. The revenue created from those land sales would then be used to operate the federal government. Land sales would be used to operate the federal government. Okay? So this is basically a trade for the sovereignty over the unoccupied lands, or the lands that had been claimed by the government, giving over to individual settlers and selling that land. Okay. Well, this operated for quite a long time, better part of 70, 80 years, and the process was too slow. The process was not very efficient. Most American settlers didn't bother to go to the federal government to purchase land. They just went out onto it and squatted on it. They were squatters, or they claimed it with what were called preemptive rights. So the federal government went through a number of iterations to try to encourage settlers to purchase land from the federal government. And they did things like reduce the price, and they did things like sell large areas of federal land over to people who had a lot of cash, or proprietors who would then sell it off to others. So basically, they tried to sell it off wholesale, and that still really wasn't a very efficient way to get rid of an enormous amount of federal land. Eventually, in 1862, during the Civil War, the Union passed something called the Homestead Law, the first Homestead Law, Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act was the first of several laws that basically did this. It said anybody who wants to claim land can claim up to 160 acres and get title to that land if they create improvements on the land for 5 years, and they basically have somebody vouch for them doing this. That was the first Homestead Law. Oklahoma was settled under that same Homestead Law. The first land runs, 1889, followed the same purpose. When people made the land run into central Oklahoma, they were able to claim 160 acres per person. So the Homestead Act allowed much of the Great Plains and the western part of the United States to be settled fairly rapidly. Free land, basically. Now, the problem with, if we can go back to 1785, to give away the land meant that you had to be able to describe the land, because this is all about property and property rights. In order to convey the land in measurable parcels of 160 acres or whatnot, the land had to be surveyed. And up until this point, land survey in the United States followed the old British system known as metes and bounds. METES and bounds. So we'll look at some patterns of that in a little bit, but basically it's a very chaotic system. It had no regularity to it. That changed with Thomas Jefferson's public land survey system. And what we have is the creation of a Cartesian grid over the surface of the earth. Now, in a previous lecture, you recall that I mentioned that when you take a Cartesian grid, a 90-degree grid, and try to cover a curved surface, a spherical surface, you get error, right? You get problems, and that's, of course, what happened. But this is the system worked for the most part, and there were correction lines that had to be placed into it. for the most part, we have a system of land survey in the United States west of the original 13 colonies and not including Tennessee and Kentucky. Most of the survey system throughout the rest of the United States, with the exception of Texas, parts of Louisiana, follow this survey system. Why Texas? Why is Texas an exception in the United States Land Survey? Texas was a republic before it was a state, and they had their own land survey system. And not the entire state wasn't surveyed under the Republic of Texas system, but much of it was. And before that, before the Texas Republic, Texas was part of Mexico, and before that, part of Spain. And so the Spanish system of land survey was utilized in Texas as well. Well, let's talk about the Township and Range or Public Land Survey System. It's a Cartesian grid that divides the land up into building blocks that we call townships. Those townships are 6 miles by 6 miles square, containing 36 square miles of area. And each one of those square miles are referred to as sections, each one of those sections being 1 mile by 1 mile, or the equivalent of 640 acres. An acre is an English measure of land area, if you're not familiar with that term. Is there a good analogy for the size of 1 acre of land? You ever heard of this? Can you visualize how big 1 acre is? No, it's kind of difficult. Can you visualize the size of a football field, the United States football field? That's right about 1 acre. Okay? So you can imagine 1 acre about the size of a football field. Pretty good size area, right? So 1 square mile would be 640 football fields. Something like that. A quarter section, which is the size of the General Land Office's standard farm size, is 640 divided by 4, 160 acres. So that 160 acres comes from dividing that section into quarters. Now, if you divide the quarters, you get quarters of a quarter, and that would be 160 acres divided by 4, or 40 acres. This is the type of question you'll receive in some of the quizzes. A quarter of a quarter of a quarter would be 40 acres divided by 4, or 10 acres. So that's a nice way of dividing up land into divisions. And you can see that each square can be subdivided into smaller squares so that the property boundaries, what do we call property boundaries on the map? Do you recall that? Wasn't it cadastre? So a map that portrays land ownership is a cadastral map. That was a previous module. So your boundaries, your property lines of the parcels on the map are making up a cadastral map. Now this allows fairly accurate legal description of land without the need for the use of landmarks. Well, there are landmarks, there are pins, and there are markers in the U.S. Land Survey. But here I'm referring to landmarks as were used in the Meets and Bounds Survey, which were things like the great old oak tree, the boulder next to the creek, all right? Those sorts of things are problematic. Even things like a river course or a stream as a boundary are very problematic because streams don't keep their same channel. They change over time. There are parts of Oklahoma, by the way. You know Oklahoma's southern boundary with Texas is the Red River. There are pieces of Oklahoma that are actually south of the present course of the Red River. And there are pieces of Texas that are actually north of the Red River now because the boundary was set and the river has changed. Okay? Anyway, this is what that looks like. So you'll need to probably study this slide if you're not familiar with it. Each state, for the most part, each state's township and range survey system contains one or more principal meridians. This is kind of like the prime meridian, but it's not exactly associated with a line of longitude. It's not keyed to a line of longitude. Somebody tell me why. A history major, if there are any history majors or social science education majors in here, you should probably be able to tell me. Based on what I've said in previous lectures. The principal meridians don't follow lines of longitude, right? Why not? Okay, when was the public land survey system established? 1785. When was longitude established? Remember? 1884. 100 years earlier. Okay, so we have the public land survey, which preceded our standard latitude longitude measures by almost a century. Okay? Almost a century, 99 years. Cool. All right, so that's why your principal meridians don't. I mean, many of the principal meridians did come after 1884, including the ones. No, Oklahoma was actually before 1884. So even Oklahoma's, which is one of the last ones, did precede longitude. Anyway, that's trivial, and obviously I'll try to get off of it. So anyway, you have these principal meridians. If you've ever driven into Stillwater from I-35, you have crossed the principal meridian of Oklahoma from west to east. And it is located just a few miles outside of Stillwater, and the name in Oklahoma is the Indian Meridian. That's all it is, the Indian Meridian. It doesn't have a number or anything associated with it. Each state also, for the most part, has a baseline. Sometimes states share the principal meridian, and maybe they share a common baseline. It just has to do, and I'll show you an example in a second, map. But in Oklahoma, we have that one principal meridian. We have another principal meridian that does follow the 103rd meridian, called the Cimarron meridian. And that's only used in the Panhandle. But the baseline of Oklahoma is down in the southern part of the state, and the baseline is, it's Murray County near Davis, Oklahoma. Anybody ever been to Davis, Oklahoma? Okay. Davis, Oklahoma is very close to the baseline and the principal meridian, what's called the origin or the very first origin point of the survey system. So let's talk about how what these numbers and letters indicate. Each one of these is a township, a 6 by 6 mile township, and each one, and this goes for not just Oklahoma but all the states, each one of these townships is named, it has an actual name, but it's named with a marker that indicates the number of townships north of the baseline and the number of townships east of, in this case, east or away from the principal meridian. And so this is 1 north, 1 east. Township 1 north, 1 east. This is township 2 north, 1 east. 3 north, 1 east. This one's 2 north, 3 east. So 2 north, 3 east. And then over here you have north and west, and then over here you have south and west and south and east. So here's your example, township 2 south, range 4 east. By the way, I didn't say range. Townships, the term township refers to north or south of the baseline. The term range means east or west of the principal meridian. East or west of the principal meridian. Here in Stillwater, we're on just on the east side of the principal meridian, the Indian meridian, and we're way up north of the baseline. Okay, so we're close to the meridian, just on the east side, but we're way up in terms of townships. So this township 2 south, range 4 east, and then what we have, you'll notice that the 36-mile sections within a township are numbered in this zigzag fashion. They always start in the upper or the northeast corner, and they go west and then south and then back to the east. So this zigzag pattern is intentional so that there is obvious the ability for people to quickly see which township section is in. So here's an example of section number 14 from Township 2 South, Range 4 East on this map. And then if we take that section and we blow it up so that we can see it in a larger scale map still. So this is larger scale, smaller scale, even smaller scale. So larger scale map here. If we were to actually look at perhaps where the land holdings are today, then you might see that most of the time there's going to be a division here with the quarter sections, because that's usually where the homesteaders claim early on. But in this case, you can see maybe this was a homestead at one time, but since it's been subdivided and sold off into quarter sections. And this one up here, this 160 acres, has been subdivided into quarter sections, and one quarter has been subdivided into quarters of quarters, and this one has been halved. So if we were to look at these variations, remember that the building block here is, this is 160 acres, right? The whole thing is 640 acres, 160 acres, and then what would one of these quarter of a quarter be? 40 acre, and then these would be 10. Okay, so 10, 40, 160, 640. What would two quarters of a quarter be? So this would be 10 and 10, so this would be a 20, right? Is that right? So 20 and 20 is 40, right? Okay, good. All right. So this is a way of looking at land, and the other thing that you'll often see is, I'll show you an example here. This is the map of the United States with its principal meridians and baselines and survey systems. You can see that in Oklahoma, here's the Indian meridian. This is what all of Oklahoma except the Panhandle uses to measure distance east and west of the townships. And then the baseline goes right through about Davis right there. And there's not a lot of townships south in Oklahoma. The Panhandle has a little bit different history because originally it was part of Texas. It was divided from Texas and attached. It was divided from Texas in 1850. You may know that if you're from Texas. In 1850, and then from 1850 to 1890, 40 years, this was known as no man's land. It was a sort of a stepchild of all the territories and states. It was not part of any one particular state. In fact, there was a minor movement to try to make the Panhandle into its own state, but it didn't work very well. Climate kind of made that a problem. But anyway, the Panhandle was attached to Oklahoma Territory in 1890. It was originally called Beaver County, and then they later subdivided it into 3 other counties. But this, because it was later, they used this particular meridian that is shared with New Mexico as the principal meridian. So basically, everything in the Panhandle has a range east of the principal meridian. Trivia, okay? But you can see also that the original 13 colonies do not have the public land survey system, and Tennessee and Kentucky, which were established as parts of Virginia and parts of North Carolina and settled and surveyed before 1785 have a different survey system. They were utilizing the meets and bounds survey system. Ohio is the state where the meets and bounds survey system was put into place first, and they actually have a number of other survey systems. So Ohio is the state where you have both experimental pre-public land survey and the public land survey itself. Now this produces you can't see that, sorry about that, it's kind of dark. The landscape produced by the public land survey is very distinctive. Americans who have grown up west of the Appalachian Mountains outside of Tennessee and Kentucky are used to this pattern on the landscape, particularly if you're from the Middle West or the Great Plains, like here in Oklahoma. This is a very familiar sort of aerial photograph where you have section lines, you have roads basically following the section lines. The roads basically followed those section lines because that is where you have easements for travel. That's where property boundaries were located. You also may notice that the field patterns, even well over 100 years later, for the most part 100, and the survey in Oklahoma was about, I believe, 1876, well before settlement. But so you've got nearly 150 years, 140 years of the survey system existing, and well over 100 years after settlement. But the property boundaries still conform to that rectilinear 90-degree angle pattern. Even though you'll find smaller parcels of land, you'll see land that's kind of subdivided into smaller and smaller parcels. For the most part, the rectilinear pattern remains and probably will remain for centuries upon centuries. Now, the settlement pattern that you'll see is one of farms, and you'll notice that and this is actually from Minnesota, this particular landscape. It's one of the flattest rural areas you'll find in the United States, which is also fairly productive agriculturally. That's why I selected this particular one. But in this area, it's been glaciated, it's very, very flat. And you'll see farms, for the most part, about every quarter mile, or every half mile, something like that. About every section originally had about 4 farms. However, in modern times, certainly since about 1920, the number of farms in the United States has consistently decreased. The number of farms has consistently decreased in the United States since at least 1920. While this place in Minnesota may have been settled in the 1870s, maybe even 1860s by farmers under the homestead laws, giving each farmer, or basically each mile section, at least 4 farms, you can tell that far from 4 farms still exists. In most cases, you might just see one farmer, not even at all one farmstead, even on this mile section. That's because farms today require far more than 160 acres. In fact, most farms in places like the Midwest require far more than 640 acres. Typically, they require several thousand acres, depending on the type of activity. Now, in the Middle West, maybe in the dairy belt, perhaps 1,200 acres, 2-mile sections would make you a living, but it would be pretty marginal there. If you're in western Oklahoma growing wheat, you got to have at least 2,000 acres in order to get by anymore. So that's a sign of progress, however. Fewer farmers means more and more productive farmers. Agriculture is highly productive in the United States. All right, let's talk about those other survey systems that are still in use. The meets and bounds system, as I mentioned, was a British system that preceded the United States independence. It utilizes landmarks for points, and this was used in the original colonies, Kentucky and Tennessee. And one of the main reasons why Jefferson and the Confederation Congress came up with the public land survey system was because they could never imagine being able to dispose of the public domain through a system of settlement similar to what the British utilized over their 2 centuries of slow settlement in the east, along the eastern seaboard. In other words, the meets and bounds system was very slow to develop. It was perhaps in many ways more efficient, but it was not a regular survey that was easy to convey land from. So the idea was that, one of the big problems that became apparent by about the middle part of the 1700s, early 1700s, was that farmers, plantations throughout the eastern seaboard often had many boundary disputes. They had property boundary disputes with one another. Courthouses were kept very busy trying to resolve disputes between property owners because the survey system was so vague and so debatable. It was easy to make an argument that someone was using your land. Not only that, courthouses burned and records were lost, and there was no regular settlement system. So the public land survey system, one of the prerogatives of the survey system was to eliminate or at least reduce litigation, that is, court cases, between landowners. And it did that in a wonderful way. Not only were boundaries for the most part crystal clear, but the land could actually be described and purchased without ever visiting the land in person. So the public land survey system uses an abstract system to basically create a grid across the landscape that allows the land to be subdivided and disposed of at a distance and in a very regular, systematic way. Other survey systems existing in the United States included the system that the French utilized. The French, of course, were the colonizers, the colonists of what is today Quebec and Canada, but they were also active in Louisiana, in Missouri, and in Michigan. And in those states, you will find remnants of what's referred to as the Arpent system, sometimes referred to as the French long lot system. So the French system used a French-based system of survey. You find this very, very commonly, not just in Quebec, but in South Louisiana. If you've ever flown into New Orleans or into Baton Rouge, you will see the French long lots that follow the river courses, whether that's the bayous of South Louisiana, Bayou Teche, Bayou Lafourche, or whether it's the Mississippi River itself or its distributaries. You will find the survey system that radiates away from the river course. And I think I will show you an example in a second of that. Now, what the long lot did, why did the French survey long lots? The main reason was because they wanted to produce access. They wanted to, the survey system allowed farmers to place their farmsteads along the river course, which was used for transportation. But it also allowed them to claim land of different quality and land that had different purposes. So they claimed land close to the river, which was the high ground that was not in, really wasn't in danger of flooding because it was on the natural levee. And then they would utilize fields beyond the natural levee. And as you go farther away from the river, the land generally gets lower in elevation and may get a little swampier. That land was often used for grazing animals. And then sometimes there is land beyond the floodplain that held timber that was utilized for other resources. So the urban system allowed the French settlers to live close together for security reasons and for transportation reasons near the river with their farmsteads, but it also allowed them to claim land of varying quality and varying resource bases. And that was the tradition within France. And you can still find in French-speaking areas of Europe the long line. The Republic of Texas system I mentioned earlier, and this was a system created by the Spanish. Well, it was based on some of the Spanish precedents within Texas, but this was a system that was created by Anglo-Texan settlers beginning in the 1826 when Stephen F. Austin established the Austin Colony down in south central Texas. And their system expanded fairly rapidly as Texas grew during the 1820s and 1830s and 1840s, and prior to statehood in 1845. So the Republic of Texas system, of course, I guess came after 1836, after Texas was an independent republic. So it has a lot of variations in it. It's not quite as rigid as the United States Public Land Survey system. If you've ever driven in Texas, right? What's the name of the county road or the system of rural highways? You ever heard of farm to market roads or FM roads? Those are the roads that basically connect market towns, and it's a very efficient, very efficient system of roads. Unlike what you would find in Oklahoma, which for the most part roads generally followed the grid system, and so our roads have a tendency to go either east, west, or north, south, and not deviate diagonally. In Texas, it's different. Texas roads go diagonally all the time. So that's one of those holdovers, or one of those artifacts of the Texas survey system. This is an example of a meets and bounds survey. You're looking at a cadastral map, a land ownership map, and where was this? I think this is in Virginia. But the land ownership map has no clear system of survey. You can see this dashed line, or these are roads. The solid lines are parcel or property boundaries. Okay, and each one of those lines, those survey lines, are based on landmarks that may or may not be there anymore. So this is an example of what a meets and bounds survey system is like. This is an example of a meets and bounds survey in eastern Pennsylvania. This is kind of it's not a long lot system, but these fields are just kind of elongated. But you'll notice that the fields really have no geometric similarity. They're different sizes, different shapes. The access is different everywhere. Very, very chaotic. This is an old historical map from the French survey, and you can see here cadastral. You can see the ARPANET survey, as you might want to call it. This particular map. I've got this map, the full thing, in my office, and it shows the locations of plantations along the lower Mississippi River, and you can see the St. John Baptist Parish and Lake Allemande down in South Louisiana. This is, and you can see a township area here, but for the most part, you're looking at the old plantations and the names of the owners of the plantations along the river. So that's what long lots look like. If you look at them from the aerial view, this is South Louisiana again. Most of the roads in South Louisiana will follow the bayou, or they'll follow the river channel, because that's the high ground. That's where you're going to find the highest. The land that doesn't stay underwater when you do have a flood. So it may get a little wet, but it's the first piece of land to dry out. The water will flow back down through here. So this is the particular survey system, ARPAN survey system. In Texas, you have, like I said, a fairly interesting mix, but you can actually see a combination of Spanish and French, Texan, and the United States Land Survey within the state of Texas. So it's one of the most interesting states when it comes to land survey history. You can see some of these areas where the Texan, the long lot survey, the Spanish long lot survey was used in Texas. And you have a more rectangular survey, not surprisingly, out here in the open part of the state. We'll end up with this, and this is just a little bit on the Sanborn fire insurance maps. The Sanborn fire insurance maps are available to you in the OSU library online. You can also find them in archives around the country. These are wonderful maps for understanding changes that took place in towns and cities in the United States during the late 1800s and the early 1900s. These are used by people who are interested in historic preservation, or as your textbook refers to it, heritage, the heritage industry. That's in chapter 2. And basically, these maps were created as they were created in a systematic fashion across the United States. So most every town in the United States has a set of Sanborn maps, color maps, hand-drawn, very, very information-rich source. And they were created with the purpose to allow fire insurance assessment. So, as you probably know, a lot of cities like Chicago and San Francisco burned to the ground and had a tendency to lose lots and lots of property very quickly. The invention of the growth of the insurance industry, particularly for cities, was something that required insurance companies to have an idea of risk. And so the risk associated with a building, a commercial building or a home burning to the ground is what these maps were created for. The idea is maybe the town has a fire department, but perhaps they don't have enough available personnel to get a fire wagon to a house a mile away. So fire insurance rate for that little town would vary from place to place. Anyway, so it recorded architectural and building features. If you're in architecture, you'd be interested in this sort of thing. It recorded all sorts of building information, both domestic houses as well as commercial buildings. You'll be able to see the footprint of the building, the construction materials, the type of business, and that's why a lot of people utilize these now. Is they can figure out what was going on at this lot at a certain time in the past. The surveyors usually resurveyed the towns every few years because as places would change, as as new buildings would go up, the fire insurance companies needed to know what was out there. And so we have now a time series of change in small towns and large cities across the United States. This is an example of a Sanborn map. I put it on its side just so that you can see it a little bit better, but this is from the town of Lexington, Oklahoma. And Lexington, Oklahoma is just down around Norman, isn't it? It's not, I think, is it McLean County or is it Cleveland County? I'm not sure. One of those. And anyway, Lexington today is a fairly small town. It was a lot bigger in the old days. But you can see the main street, and this is just one of many, many maps from just 1 year of the Sanborn maps. What you're looking at here in the pink are business buildings, and the yellow buildings are with D on them mean dwelling. So you can kind of get an idea of what's going on here. You can see if you look at these very closely, I don't know if you know downtown Lexington, Oklahoma or not, but here's the Lexington Hotel. You can see the bank on the corner. There's a general store here, another general store here, and if I just go down the list here, here's a saloon. I don't know what that says. Clothing, saloon, drugs, clothing, barbershop, saloon. Lots of saloons in Lexington. Isn't that interesting? Etc. So you can look at how the landscape existed sometime in the past. This is the date on the map is 1902. So 1902, Lexington, Oklahoma. It's about the only record we have of small towns and that sort of thing in